And now, Our Duty in the Venezuelan Crisis by Representative Joseph Wheeler of Alabama and Representative Charles H. Grosvenor of Ohio. 1. The expressions which have passed into history as the Monroe Doctrine were contained in the message which was delivered by President Monroe to the 18th Congress, December 2, 1823. We were then a weak republic of about 10.5 million people, and at that time the nations of Europe were enjoying profound peace. More than 8 years had elapsed since the close of the terrific wars which had shaken that continent during the quarter of a century which preceded the Battle of Waterloo. The European powers had reorganized and improved their military and naval establishments, strengthened their financial conditions, and were better prepared for war than at any former period. Great Britain, France, Spain, Denmark, and Holland were governments which took special pride and interest in extending and building up their American colonies. In addition to this, the strongest nations of Europe had agreed to lend one another on every occasion and in every place assistance, aid, and support. And it was soon apparent that these nations intended the subjugation of the Spanish colonies in America. It was in the face of this menacing attitude of powerful European nations that President Monroe announced that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. He further declared that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. If under such conditions this doctrine could be maintained by a comparatively weak power of 10 million people, should it not be enforced in the strictest sense by the same nation which now contains a population of 70 millions and has become the richest and most powerful sovereignty on earth? The American people have always abstained from any interference in the internal concerns of any European powers, but I believe they are practically unanimous that a nation like ours should maintain such a policy upon this hemisphere as is dictated by our best interests. To do less would be at the sacrifice of our dignity and the loss of the respect of the nations of the earth. Through her aggressive colonial policy, England already possesses dependencies on this hemisphere which comprise territory containing 3,541,505 square miles, about equal to the entire area of the United States, and including numerous islands, some of which are within a few hours' sail of our shores. We have always carefully abstained from any interference with these possessions of Great Britain, but to allow that nation to extend her territory on this hemisphere either by treaty or purchase or conquest or by the insidious encroachments which have characterized her dealings with Venezuela, the people of the United States should resist with all the power they possess. England fully understands that the principles announced by Mr. Monroe have become a settled policy of the United States, and as such must be considered and accepted as principles of international law. Venezuela, originally a dependency of Spain, was acquired by that nation by the right of discovery about the year 1499. A year later, the Spanish explored the delta of the Orinoco and in 1531 extended their explorations up that river to the mouth of the Meta. This, by virtue of the rule laid down at that time and always acquiesced in by European nations, gave Spain an unquestioned title to this territory. Many years later, the Dutch established a settlement east of the Essequibo River near the site of the present city of Georgetown. By the Treaty of Munster in 1648, it was stipulated that Spain and Holland were to remain in possession of the territory, then in actual possession of each. And 65 years later, Great Britain agreed to aid the Spaniards to recover their ancient dominions in America, the treaty stating these to be the same as in the time of Charles II. By the Treaty of Recognition by Spain, the provinces were ceded by name to the new republic. England's title to Dutch Guyana was derived in 1814 from the United Netherlands, the treaty simply designating them as the colonies of Demerara, Essequibo, and Berbice. But in none of the treaties are the geographical boundaries designated. It is therefore clear that the dividing line must be that which was recognized as the boundary between the Spanish and Dutch settlements at the time they existed as such. This is all Venezuela has ever demanded, and for England to contend for more than this would be an attempt to violate the Monroe Doctrine by the extension of European colonies in America. Our government should, therefore, by a frank and manly communication, demand that England agree that arbitrators shall determine, by such evidence as can be produced, the boundary lines between the Spanish and Dutch colonies prior to the cession of 1814, by which England first acquired title. If this request is not acceded to, it will show conclusively that England has decided to dispute the right of the United States to maintain the doctrine laid down by President Monroe in 1823. It will also prove that Great Britain has determined by force to extend her colonies in America, and we cannot be too prompt in meeting and resenting any such purpose. More than 50 years ago, Venezuela entered a most earnest remonstrance against encroachments then being made by England, and from that date, that republic has been pleading for some conventional agreement, some plan of arbitration, or some method of compromise. She's been answered by evasions and delays, during which England has gradually but steadily enlarged her pretensions, until now that nation claims the entire Orinoco Delta and 29 miles of territory to the west of that river. To understand the importance of this claim, we must consider that the Orinoco floats the largest ships for 400 miles, and many of its 100 tributaries are navigable far into the interior, so that the control of the mouth of the Orinoco carries with it almost a monopoly of the trade and commerce of nearly a third of the South American continent. Upon a question somewhat similar to the one now presented, President Polk recommended the occupation of territory in Yucatan, declaring that we would not consent to a transfer of this domain and sovereignty to either Spain, Great Britain, or any other European power. Our population at that time was about 20 million, and certainly a policy we then boldly asserted can now be firmly maintained. So far from receding from the strictest construction of the doctrine laid down by Monroe, my views are that the United States should extend its policy and look to the establishment of depots and naval stations around which American colonies would locate, sufficiently strong to encourage and protect our trade and commerce. England's success in extending her trade and commerce is largely due to her first establishing colonies or footholds in countries the trade of which she sought to secure. American toil now produces substantially 30% of the staple products of the world. We have but 4% of its population, and foreign trade has become an essential outlet for American products. The principle of the Monroe Doctrine did very well in 1823. President Polk advanced a step in 1848. We must take another step forward in 1895. I would deplore any action which would endanger our amicable relations with England, but we must realize that they are largely due to our allowing that nation a practical monopoly of the most valuable trade and commerce of the world, and Americans must understand that friction will certainly follow any material invasion of English markets by American products. Joseph Wheeler. 2. The United States should plant itself immovably upon a just and intelligent definition of the Monroe Doctrine in defining its attitude toward the Venezuelan situation. The position taken by our government at the time of the occupation of a part of Mexico by Maximilian, acting as the agent of the French government, reaffirmed the Monroe Doctrine in unmistakable terms, and our position was accepted as the true one by the nations of the world. But recently, the course of our government has upon several occasions cast doubt and uncertainty over our probable future attitude, and the time has now come when the United States should make clear and unmistakable the purpose to maintain the position taken in the Mexican case, or we should cease to discuss the subject and abandon the Monroe Doctrine permanently and give public notice thereof. To temporize is cowardice, to equivocate, dishonor. That England has violated the Monroe Doctrine, or in other words, that England has done acts which challenge the opposition of the United States, is plain and undeniable. It may be said that she did not seize any territory at the time of her controversy with Nicaragua, that is, she did not attempt to acquire and annex Nicaraguan territory, but it is true that she committed acts of oppression based upon a technical claim and punished an inferior American republic with brutality. The United States should have protested then and have demanded explanation and satisfaction. That we did not has encouraged the subsequent aggressions in Venezuela. The original declaration of the Monroe Doctrine, as made on behalf of our government, contained this important statement. But with the governments who have declared their independence and maintained it, and whose independence we have, on great consideration and on just principles, acknowledged, we could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them, or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition towards the United States. The levying of an unjust assessment is in the nature of blackmail upon a helpless state. The seizure of her ports by an armed force was an invasion of the principle of the Monroe Doctrine, and it was weak and cowardly on the part of our government to submit to it without protest. The action of the United States amounted to a waiver of our position hitherto, and it may be well urged by Great Britain as amounting almost to an estoppel if we reassert the doctrine. The proposition of England, as recently announced by Sir Julian Pauncefote, that England will arbitrate the question of her right to territory which she admits she holds by doubtful tenure, but will refuse to arbitrate questions in regard to territory which she is pleased to say she holds by indisputable title, is a simple repudiation of all recognition of arbitration whatever, and it indicates the hypocrisy of the movement by which a member of the British Parliament paraded himself across the ocean and came to Congress in the last session with his arms full of petitions in favor of an international system of arbitration. We have lost standing among the nations of the earth by the course we have already taken, and in the failures already manifested, and we had infinitely better surrender all pretense of adherence to the Monroe Doctrine and abandon the American continent to the ravages of European aggression than to any longer pretend to uphold it, and yet be guilty of the failures of the past 2 years. Our attitude should be that of unflinching and unfaltering devotion to the principles and practices of this government hitherto, and in so doing we shall not bring war upon the United States, but we shall protect ourselves against war by securing respectful recognition of our national purpose by all the nations of the world. At this time, England seems to have special interest in South American affairs. Her efforts to secure trading belonging legitimately to her commercial rivals have been supplemented by an interference in the Mosquito Country, which clearly manifests a disposition to control, if possible, the ownership of the great Trans-Isthmus Canal. England should not be permitted to succeed in this scheme. The building and control of that gigantic artery of international commerce should be the dearest object of American statesmanship. The attitude of the United States towards the Venezuelan question should be that of determined opposition to any movement of England, the result of which would impair or weaken our ancient declaration of support of the Monroe Doctrine. Our construction of the scope of that doctrine should be proclaimed and adhered to. Once proclaimed, a faithful adherence to and recognition of our construction by the nations of the earth should be the conditions upon which alone friendly relations with us can be maintained. Charles H. Grosvenor.